So, here is a video. I am going to try my best to make it at least thought-provoking, and I have to be careful with how I frame this so it is not misconstrued, because it is a critique of something that society seems to hold rather dear, and a ponderance on another issue that tends to make the many nervous. One of the things that many might notice about the political scene is it is quite dull. After a while it grows stale because of technological innovation, the overt propaganda. There's all of this information whizzing by in a great mass. It's all interconnected, yet feels disengaged at the same time in a way that you can't put your finger on, but there is this lingering feeling of something missing or off that you can't quite describe. But you get this sense that if you see it or feel it, you'll go, this is what I've been looking for. At least this was the case for me. It's why I've stopped watching or listening to a sizable chunk of people, because something in the back of my head was going, the wheels are spinning, but I'm not exactly learning anything new here. It felt like the same tug of war over and over again. So when I heard about Mencius Mollbug and the concept of the cathedral, that quickly piqued my interest, so I started to look into that, reading his works, and that was this is the thing that I've been looking for, and that was the gateway down the red pill rabbit hole. Definitely do take some time to read Unqualified Reservations. All of his work is still there. And this is something to really think about. It is difficult to be the outsider. It's difficult to be outside of the group. There's undoubtedly more scrutiny and ridicule, sort of comes with the territory, really. However, if one were to take a glance at history, what moves the masses is never from within the mass. What moves the masses always comes from outside the masses. All of the ideas that are interesting and unusual and, I dare say, dangerous comes from the fringes. So if one wishes to take a deeper dive into that world, the masses is not your chosen destination, it's the fringes. What I want people to think about is democracy. Now, I'm fully aware pulling at democracy tends to evoke an almost theologian type of reaction in people, mainly because we don't have any other personal intimate experience with anything else. It is this holy sacred ritual that must be protected at all cost, never to be criticized, especially by the Americans. They're the most indoctrinated with this idea of democracy. It's supposedly the foundation of their country, and history is written by the victor, so one can hardly blame them. It's what makes Hans Hermann Hoppe's book, Democracy, the God That Failed, quite an apt title. It is a book I would recommend for those who wish to take a more in-depth look into these sort of ideas outside of the democratic realm, so to speak. It's a book that Mollbug himself recommended as one that took him away from the Rothbardian brand of libertarianism, and both Rothbard and Hoppe come from the Mises Institute, so you can take that as a strong endorsement. One of the more entertaining and very rich in language reads is H.L. Mencken's Notes on Democracy. This is a man who said he does not believe in democracy, but is perfectly willing to admit that it provides the only really amusing form of government ever endured by mankind, and that he enjoys it immensely. It is incomparably idiotic and hence incomparably amusing. But if people want a more philosophical look into these ideas, then check out Eric van Conrad-Leden's Liberty or Equality, The Challenge of Our Time, an excellent read about the concept that democratic equality is not based upon liberty, as is commonly believed, but rather the total state. It's one you can download from the Mises website. If a book seems a bit daunting and you want to dip a toe into the waters of monarchy, there's a really good article called The Libertarian Case for Monarchy by Professor Leyland Yeager. For those who still cling to the faithful idea of democracy, I think it will be a challenge to say with earnest the democratic government are the institutions that grants us and protects our rights. The last 2 years of life has thoroughly debunked any such notions as far as I'm concerned. And for all of the American bluster about their sacred constitution, it is quite clear it is not a unifying document, universally held up with religious devotion as it is among the many more conservative ilk of their nation. It hasn't been for over 100 years. The ideas and philosophies espoused within those documents are but words on a piece of paper, and require the actions and fortitude of good-willed men to bring them to fruition. One can look at how each state has handled the coup differently. You can see this idea in practice. Which brings us to a much maligned word, centralization. If we look at a business, you will see its hierarchical structure. It has a centralized figure, the CEO. often appointed and held to account by the board of directors, the shareholders, then you get the managers, the regional managers, various departments, etc., etc. The CEO wields a substantial amount of power over the company. The various departments routinely have meetings. They'll look at reports, analyze productivity, what can be cut, what's an unnecessary expenditure. All these fine details are gone over to increase productivity and decrease costs, all of which makes the business more effective to provide a better, more cost-effective product for the consumer. It's the free market at work, and this model has served society rather well. However, when it comes to government, this dynamic model is thrown out of the window and subverted entirely. Rather than having less people, as one has with the business model, which streamlines the process, we have more people, which makes things more inefficient. Rather than having less people, which makes things cheaper, we have more people, which adds costs, in this case to the taxpayer. We enact all of these insanely backward measures under the delusion that it mitigates corruption, that it holds people to account through the creation of something we call the separation of powers. Is this at all what happens? No, not at all. In fact, not only does this creation cease to prohibit the induction and spread of corruption, it makes it inevitable. Not only do they make it inevitable, they make it incredibly difficult and expensive to suss out when the accountability is spread over a massively bloated and oversized bureaucracy. With a smaller group of people, the corruption is much easier and quicker to identify. There's less places to look. A concept that people seem to have trouble wrapping their heads around is the size, scope, and enforcement capacity of power. There seems to be a misapprehension in the case of displacement of power. The idea that size and scope of power is fixed. If one were to drastically reduce the size of the state and remove institutions, rather than dissipate with the exodus of the bureaucracy, the powers will be condensed into the few that remain post-culling, i.e., centralization will take place. Centralization means nothing unless there is a capacity to exercise and enforce the power. This is why libertarians advocate for smaller government, because less bureaucracy is a decrease in its capacity to wield power, and it's cheaper. And then we get to this idea of representation, and that people have a say in their government. Do they really? The majority thinks they have a say, and the minority don't have a say at all. If their candidate doesn't win, they are potentially subjected to regulations and changes they didn't vote for. And even then, their exercise in democracy is only viable in stage 2 of this process. Stage 1 is how did the representative get in a position to be elected in the first place? That's where special interest groups come in. You can say the elected official is the will of the people, but in reality, it's a pre-chosen candidate propped up by the funding of elites. You can say it's chosen by the people, however, once in power, they will do the bidding of those who propped them up for election in the first place. And many of these come from the same environment: institutions, universities, Ivy Leagues, many a family dynasty. Same old money keeps that train going, has done so for over a century. Happens when a president is elected as well. They're bankrolled. All you're doing is selecting a red or blue variant, but they all come from the same elite club. And then we get to this concept of accountability, or rather the lack thereof. See, a politician's time is limited, where they can pretty much behave with impunity depending on what power backs them, unless they piss off those who back them, in which case they'll get an axe in the back at a speed that will break the sound barrier. I suspect nearly everyone wishes for any and all politicians to face some sort of repercussions for their sins, at least in this life anyway, but they never do. When a new person comes in, much of the displeased disposition that was aimed towards those who are on their way out dissipates and is replaced with hopeful expectations of the new entry. Think of this transfer of power as the emergence of a new regime. Something Mohlberg said that really stuck with me was, if you're going to construct a new regime, the one thing you can never do is go after members of the old regime. This is why he said on Tucker that the federal government of Germany, to this day, still pays retired Stasi and Wehrmacht officers. It became accepted that those were both legitimate forms of government of the German state, and if you serve them, you're entitled to your pension. As much as it may pain us, and it is essentially just the machine not breaking itself apart, it does seem to be the mechanism by which stability is maintained, and this manifests itself in our eyes as a complete lack of accountability. I'm aware I have not presented a solution to these issues, just critiques. That might be a longer video for the future, it's what reading books and live streams are for. But if I can make people think on these critiques and read on some of the links or books, hey, that's enough for me. I hope you've gotten some food for thought, and that's all for today. Until next time.